Hi, this is Dan Heisman, and we're here with another YouTube video to help you improve your chess game. Alright, I thought today we would talk about an idea I see a lot in some of my students' games. It's called seeing ghosts. Seeing ghosts means, obviously, seeing something that's not really there. And in chess, that could mean quite a few things. So I made a list of some of the things that could mean, and I'll try to give examples for some of them. The first one I thought we'd look at is where you are afraid of something that could not easily happen. So let's say in this position, white plays bishop takes g6. Alright, so black has two ways to take. He can play h takes g6 and he can play f takes g6. Do you know what general principle usually applies here? And the answer is take toward the center. Now, a lot of people sometimes make the mistake here of saying, I have a rook on the f file and I don't have any semi-open files, so I should take with the f pawn and take toward the outside and open up the line for my rook. That's more important than taking toward the center. Well, once in a blue moon, that's true if there's some tactics on the f file. But here, there's no tactics on f4, there's no tactics on f3, there's no tactics on f2. So it would be very unlikely that taking with the f pawn here would be correct. It's better to have more pawns in the middle, take toward the center. But another reason why people sometimes take with the f pawn is not to open the rook. It's they're afraid of opening that rook file against the king. So I say to them, all right, well, you should play h takes g6 here. And they say, well, I can't. What if he puts a queen and a rook on the rook file, and then he threatens to play queen h8 mate? How would I stop that? Well, it's nice that they can visualize and imagine that a queen and a rook could get to the h file and that queen h8 would be difficult to stop. That would be true. The problem is that it's almost impossible for that to happen. So let's try to do that just for the fun of it to show you how hard it is. Let's basically do nothing for black and try to put a queen and a rook on the h file here. All right, so let's take with the rook pawn. Well, first of all, we have to visualize where would the rook go. The rook would have to go to h3. And the queen would have to go to h4. Can't be on h5, h6, or h7. So to get a rook on f3, we'd need to get the knight out of the way, get the bishop out of the way, and then get the rook up to f3. So let's get the knight out of the way. We'll play knight e1, and we'll play knight c6. And now we need to play f4, but we can't put the bishop on g3. It'll block the rook, and we can't put the bishop on h2 because there'll be a pawn on h3. Then the rook won't be able to get there. So we have to put the bishop on e5. All right, and now we'll play rook c8, and now f4. And now black has to make a move. We'll make some silly moves. a6, rook f3, queen d7, rook h3, rook fd8. And now let's see here. We can get the white queen to h4. We can either move the knight out of the way for black and then get the queen to g4, or we could play like queen e2, queen f2, queen h4. So I guess we'll do that. Queen e2, and black plays b5, and queen f2, and black plays c4. I'm just making silly moves for black, of course. And now queen h4. All right, Mr. Stockfish, is black in trouble here? And Stockfish says, well, white's winning by 0.3. It says black should play knight h5 to block the line. And then if we ask, but what if he plays g4? Whoops, then bishop takes h4, wins the queen. Guess we can't do that. So he has to play the queen back to f2. And basically black's okay even after all that. So what we'd have to do in order for this to work is instead of playing c4, maybe we can play knight e1. We're trying to commit suicide here for black. Knight e8, now queen a. Oh, now he still can't play queen h4. The bishop's in the way. All right, so we got to make a move for white, rook c1, and then we'll move the bishop out of the way, actually blocking the king too. Very good. So now queen h4. And now black would have to play f6, give his king a place to go, and if the queen checks and the king comes up, yes, indeed, white has a pretty nice advantage now. Of course, what we just did for the last 10 moves is do something that neither side would really do. I mean, white attempting this, Silman said in order for a plan to be reasonable has to be both effective and it has to be achievable. And this plan wasn't really achievable. We did it because black helped white. And we turned out it wasn't even that effective until we made those last couple moves. So it was kind of a silly plan. But what does this show us? Well, black would have to help white, literally, in order for that to happen. So this falls under the category of seeing ghosts. If black says, I don't want to open up the H file because I'm going to get mated, he's seeing ghosts here. In fact, let's say a Stockfish, of these two ways to capture the bishop, what's the evaluation? Let's move that up so you can see the top two moves here. Top two. All right, this is not an exception to the principle. You can see it. We're up to about 26 ply now, 27 ply. Stockfish says if you do it the normal way to take toward the middle, white's lead is only at 0.2. If you go against principle and you say, oh, I want to open up that F file for the rook, and I don't want to open up that H file for the white pieces to mate me, then white's lead is all the way up to 0.89. So right now we're looking at 0.11 versus 1.02. Well, that's almost close to dead even versus white would be on the verge of winning. That's how much of a difference it is. And I also tell my students, be aware that when you have multiple ways to capture something, it's almost always a critical move. A lot of people think, well, it doesn't make much difference when I capture. Well, yes, there's some positions where that's true, but there's an awful lot more positions where there's multiple captures and it makes a big difference. And this one looks like it doesn't make a big difference, but actually it does. We're seeing at 31 ply, 0.11 versus 0.89. Okay, so again, this was a way of seeing ghosts, and this one particular one was lines that could not easily happen. And here it's not easily possible for white to put a rook and a queen on the H file and mate after H takes G6. All right, let's bring the board back to multiples, to regular size here. What are some of the other ways that seeing ghosts could occur? Well, another way to see that ghosts could occur is a line that you think is much more dangerous than what it is. I think this is a position from a recent student's game, a London system. And the normal moves here would be to play e6 so you could bring out your king bishop and then castle, or maybe knight c6 first. Those would be the two main moves that you would play. And in fact, let's ask Stockfish again. Mr. Stockfish, what's the top two? Yeah, Dan, okay. e6 is at 0, 0, 0. Now knight c6. They're fighting for number one. They're both close to equality. Knight c6 and e6. There's really no other moves that make a lot of sense. But in this position, my student made an interesting move. He played the move a6. And I tell my students, you got to be careful about playing these pawn to rook 3 moves, meaning h3, h6, a3, a6. He played a6 here. And I'm like, why would you want to do that? I said, it's not like you really want to push your pawn to b5, and you're not really trying to keep the white pieces out of the b5 square, because the only piece right now that could go there is the bishop, and bishop to b5 check isn't a threat. It doesn't do anything. And he said, well, I was worried about bishop to b5 check. I was worried about how I would get out of check. And I said, well, let's take a look at this. I said, after e6, which is the computer's number one move, let's look at the light squared bishops. White's light squared bishop has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 legal moves. And not only does it have 5 legal moves, but it's the piece he wants to bring out. It's his, quote, good bishop because he's got pawns on dark squares in the center, although both bishops are obviously pretty good. And black's bishop after e6 blocks in the bishop. That happens a lot when you're playing black. You happen to block in that bishop, especially in d-pawn games. It's not a big deal. If you play over Grandmaster games, they do this all the time. The key idea here is to get castled as quickly as you can. But suppose white plays bishop to b5 check now. Wouldn't black be very happy to play bishop d7 and offer the trade of bishops? He has a bishop that only has one move and is blocked by a pawn, and now he's offering to trade it for a very nice bishop that's not blocked at all. This actually seems to help black, not white. So what white was afraid of, what he was seeing ghosts with playing a6, was that he thought that bishop b5 check would be something that would be difficult to deal with, when actually it's a bad move for white. White doesn't want to offer the trade of white light squared bishops in this position. And what happened in the game was, after black played a6, then white ended up gaining an extra tempo for the middle game. And when they got to the middle game, black had trouble completing his development because white was a tempo or two ahead of him and was starting to make threats, and he was having trouble getting his pieces off the back rank. And it all started when he played a6. Now, when you play other weak players, if you're like rated 900 and you play another 900, and you play a6, they probably don't punish you very much, and it doesn't end up hurting you too much, and then you think, oh, well, it was okay. But when you start playing better players who don't do stuff like this, and they get ahead of you, then all of a sudden, when you waste time playing a move like a6, you end up not catching up in development. And as I got to be a better player when I first started playing, and especially when I started playing people above like 1700, I noticed that if I wasted time on a move like this in the opening, that I got into big trouble in the middle game or the early middle game, because I couldn't finish getting all my pieces out because my opponent had all his pieces out and he was starting to make threats, and I was starting to plug the holes in the dike instead of being able to catch up in development. That wasn't something I saw as much when I played 1500 players. They didn't punish me as much that way. But I quickly learned that, you don't want to play moves like a6 here. Now, is there ever a position where a6 might be a good move in something similar to this? Yes, and you have to be careful of that when you're playing chess, because even if it's bad, 95% of the time, I could probably change around the position enough that I could find one of those 5% exceptions and say, well, here you might be able to do it. And that's another example of seeing ghosts. Sometimes people see ghosts because they play a game and they get to a certain position, and a certain idea turns out to be really bad. And then what happens is, in the future, for the next few years, every time they get to a position that has any vague similarity to that position, they go out of their way to kind of screw themselves into the corner, trying to avoid what happened to them in that one game, when in fact the position is not enough similar that it's the same thing. So what they end up doing is, whenever they get a position that's vaguely similar to the one where they did something wrong, they see ghosts and they think the same exact thing is going to happen. Well, instead of analyzing the position carefully and seeing, is that exact thing going to happen if I do this, they just say, I'll just avoid it entirely by just playing X or whatever it does, even if X is a really bad move, because it avoids that problem that they had, 143 games ago in a vaguely similar position. And it turns out where X in that game 143 games ago would have saved them, now playing X is not such a good idea. So they see ghosts. Every time they get into, if they say, oh, every time someone plays the London system, I have to do X. And the answer is, well, no, there's, all these possible positions that can come out of the London system. You don't always have to do X. So you see people doing this. They get burned from something, and then they do it on similar things. This brings up another one of the things on my list, which is hand waving. When you do things on general principles and you don't analyze well, and you don't even try to analyze well, and you just make moves on general principles, even if you should analyze well, that leads to seeing ghosts, because a lot of times you just look at a position, and instead of saying, if I do A and he does B and I do C and he does D, can I do E? Or if I do E, can he do F? Well, if F is not possible, then you don't have to worry about it. But if you just get to the original position and you say, gee, a few moves down the line, he might be able to do F, I better stop that now, that's hand waving, and that leads to seeing ghosts, because you don't know if F is really possible. You're just worried that it might happen, and you're not really analyzing to see if it's true. You're just generalizing and saying, oh, eventually he's going to do F, and that might hurt me. Well, okay, that might be good imagination, and it might be helpful in some positions. But in other positions, maybe he can never do F, or maybe if he does F, it doesn't hurt you at all, because you didn't analyze what happens if he does F. Maybe if he does F, you've got something perfectly good. Just like when we just looked at bishop b5 check bishop d7, black didn't have to play a6. It was a complete waste of time. But, he was looking ahead and saying, if he ever plays bishop b5 check, that could be a problem. I'm going to stop it. Well, again, if you analyze things and you don't hand wave, then sometimes those things that you hand wave as a problem, they might go away, or they might not exist at all, or they might really be a problem, in which case maybe then you do have to do something about it. I'm not saying that every time you hand wave, what you're hand waving doesn't make sense and could never happen. I'm saying it's a lot more likely that what you're hand waving is not going to happen than something you actually analyze and you say, oh, if this happens, he can do this. This is really dangerous. I can't let this specific sequence happen. Okay, lines that are not even there. Okay, this is another type of hand waving that happens with visualization. Let's bring out my puzzle number 24 here. Let me go here, examine %24. Okay, so this is a puzzle, I may have used it before in other videos, where I ask my students, is knight takes e5 safe? And sometimes they give me some lines and I'll say, well, is it safe? And they say, well, queen e7 pins the knight to the king. They'll say, let's say white guards it with something like bishop f4. Then black will play bishop d6, hitting it again. And then white has trouble guarding it again. Maybe he plays queen e2. And then maybe black can attack the knight again. Well, so, okay, what they're looking at is a reasonable idea. Queen e7 is a reasonable idea. And then piling up on the knight's a reasonable idea. The problem is that they're actually, when they say that, they're saying things that aren't there, because even though bishop d6 is a legal move in this position, it's not later after queen e7 because of what Grandmaster Krogius calls the retained image problem. A retained image problem is where you keep the queen on the square d8 even though it's moved to e7. So you're looking at a board where the queen's on d8, you're retaining the image there, even though in your analysis you moved it to e7. So the line we just talked about, knight takes e5, queen e7, bishop f4, bishop d6, is not legal. So what I ask people to do is I ask them to show me. And then I make the moves. I go knight takes e5, queen e7, bishop f4. I said, all right, bishop d6, show me. And then they're like, oh, I can't make that move. So that now they realize their error because I actually moved the pieces on the board, and now they don't have to visualize anymore. They could actually just use their board vision. And now they can see that bishop d6 is not possible. So that's almost an extreme example of seeing ghosts, because there you're seeing that, quote, dangerous move, bishop d6, but yet it's not even legal because of the retained image error. So in that case, it's a real ghost. It's actually a move that's illegal that you're worried about, but because of the visualization issues, it doesn't really happen. Okay, let's talk about another way that I hear people say they see ghosts. Let's say we get some position, I'm just going to make one up. e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, bishop c5, and white plays d3, and black plays knight f6, and white plays, knight c3. And now my student, the main move here is to play d6. And let's say they play d6 and white plays, let's just make a move, a3. And now they should castle. They can play other moves. I mean, bishop g4 is okay, bishop e6 is okay. But let's say they don't castle, and they never castle. And I say, well, why don't you castle? And they say, well, if I castle, white's going to throw his pawns at me, and he's going to attack me. Well, it's true. If black castles, white could play h3 and g4 instead of castling kingside and throw the pawns at him. But that's not something to worry about. Castles here. And let's bring the engine back again. Mr. Engine, what should white do? Engine says, white should win the bishop pair with knight a4. It says, once this pawn is guarded, knight a4 winning the bishop pair is a threat. All right, Stockfish, what's the second best move for white? Bishop g5, pinning the knight. What's the third best move? Third best move is b4 hitting the bishop. What's the fourth best move? There's h3, but it says after h3, black has the advantage. Well, let's play h3. h3, and we'll make this a little bigger again. Let's just say black plays bishop e6, and now white plays g4. Let's see, g4 is not going to make the top 5, is it? Stockfish says the top 5 are bishop takes e6, bishop e3, bishop a2, castle, and b4. So let's say white keeps throwing these pawns up here. Bishop takes, pawn takes. Stockfish says black should play bishop d4. Let's say he doesn't. Let's say he just moves the queen out. Queen e7, and white keeps pushing these pawns. g5. Stockfish says, okay, I'll keep my knight in the middle. h4. And let's say black develops a piece. Stockfish says black should start opening lines by pushing the pawn, which makes a tremendous amount of sense. But let's say he doesn't do that. Let's say he just plays rook a d8. Well, what's white going to play? Let's say he plays h5. All right, well, if you're black, wow, I've castled and he's got those pawns up on g5, h5. That must be really bad for me. Well, Mr. Stockfish, how would you evaluate this position? Stockfish says, if black moves his f-pawn, well, now he says queen e6. He says black has a slight advantage after queen e6, minus 0.4. Okay, so what we did here is we didn't even play black's best moves. We, on purpose, didn't play a couple of his best moves. We just played queen e7, rook a d8. We let white play the pawn to g5 and h5. And now Stockfish is saying, queen e6 at 27 ply, black has an advantage of about 0.4. Well, most players with white aren't going to do this. But even if they do this, it's not that good for white. It says black has the advantage here if black plays correctly. So if you get to positions like this, and I just picked this one out. I just made this one up. It's not a real position, but it's yes, could white push the pawns against you and attack your king? He could, but it's not something to worry about. And if you say, well, yeah, but Stockfish knows how to play against this, I don't, Dan. And when people do that, I get all panicked. Well, the answer is you can download Stockfish for free. You can go over your games with Stockfish. You could say, Stockfish, what kind of move should I be playing here when someone does something like this? And you can learn. That's why we have a lot of 11 and 12 and 13-year-old grandmasters now, and it used to be that people didn't become grandmasters till they were 16, 17, 18, because you can take these wonderfully strong engines and play what-if games with them and say, well, if someone goes here, what should I do? And if someone goes there, what should I do? And if he plays this move against me in the opening, what should I do? You could sit there all day and play what-if games with the engine and ask, how do I defend this kind of position? What kind of game moves should I play? Oh, I get to early middle games where I don't know what to do. Well, I ask the engine, what are the top 3 moves here? Are they all reasonable? If they're all reasonable, these are the kind of things that you can do. You've got all this power at your disposal to do this. So if you're seeing ghosts here and you're like, oh my goodness, he's going to push his kingside pawns. All right, but if you castle queenside here, he could push his queenside pawns here too, and if you kick your king in the middle, he could blast open the middle. Any good player, if you're playing them, no matter where you decide to put your king, can eventually try to go after it. Yes, can they go after it more easily in some positions than others? Yes, there's some positions where it's clearly terrible to castle kingside, or it's clearly terrible to castle queenside, or it's in a lot of positions it's clearly terrible to leave your king in the middle. Sure, but if you're one of these people who see ghosts and say, oh my goodness, in this position, black can't castle kingside because white's going to throw out those pawns which happen to be nowhere near your king right now. F2, G2, H2 can't get any further away from G8 than they are now. It's not like white's got this big pawn storm looming and you're going to be afraid to castle kingside. So speaking of stronger opponents, we've got another kind of seeing ghosts, and that is when people are afraid of people's ratings and they play them and all of a sudden they play completely differently because the opponent's higher rated, and they're afraid of their opponent, and that causes them to see ghosts. I always tell people, if you play that way, you're better off probably not learning your opponent's rating if you can before the game. You just play the position and play the best moves you can. If you haven't seen my earlier video on the first time I played a master, where I was paired with Sergei Garigliad, who was the best player in Philadelphia, and I was just some nobody teenage kid who had started playing 18 months ago in tournaments, and I was rated 1600 and he was rated 2200. Well, I went to the game and I said, all right, well, maybe he's probably going to win, but I'm not going to worry about that. I'm just going to play the best moves I can and see what happens. Well, every move I tried the best I could. I wasn't worried about his rating. I was just worried about the position, and I beat him. And then 6 months later, we got to the same hotel, same round, first round. Same thing happened. He was the highest rated player. I was one past the half. I got to play him again. This time I was black and he was out for revenge. And we played again and I won again, second time. That would never happen if I was afraid of him. Was I respectful? Absolutely. Did I think there was a good chance he might win? Absolutely. Would I bet on him? Probably. But was I afraid of him? No. Was I thinking I was going to lose? No. I was just playing the best move I can on every move and see what happens. If it turns out I lose, then I lose. But I'm not going to worry about losing before the game starts. I'm going to sit there and say, hey, at the start of the game, things are even. I'm going to make the best moves I can. When I asked Rich Pariseau, who was the president of our club, who was a master, I said, Mr. Pariseau, how did I beat the master? And Rich gave me that funny look he does when people ask him a silly question. And Rich said, well, why, you played better, of course. So, yeah. So another way you see ghosts is when you play good players. You're afraid, oh, he's going to do this, he's going to do that, he's going to do this. And I always tell people, remember the following principle. Always play with confidence, aggression, and respect for your opponent's moves and ideas. If you play with confidence, aggression, and respect for your opponent's moves and ideas, then you won't be overconfident when you play lower-rated players. You'll have respect for their moves. And when you play higher-rated players, you'll still play aggressively and you'll play with confidence. If you can play every game with confidence, aggression, and respect for your opponent's moves and ideas, then you shouldn't have trouble whether you're playing someone way lower or way higher. You won't have trouble with fearing them or overconfidence. Those things really shouldn't come into play. All right, again, we always tell people the best thing you can do if you enjoyed the videos is please tell all your friends about my video channel, Dan Heisman Chess. If you'd like to like the video, great. You can subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you next time. Thanks. Bye.